Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Doorstep's Book Talk series. I'm your co host, Senior Fellow here at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also a senior fellow at Carnegie Council. Very excited tonight, Nick. We have a super guest,
Yes, we
Ollie
do.
Wyne.
Wyne, who's been a longtime friend of our projects here at the Carnegie Council, part of our study groups. No stranger, I think, to some people in the audience who have had seen him on the doorstep and on some of the Carnegie Council seminars. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you to the book talk because the book you are discussing tonight about great power opportunity uh, is a theme you've been discussing with us at Carnegie over the last number of years. Questions about narrative, the great power narrative in U.S. foreign policy, but also the extent to which, as you've always warned, whether or not great power competition is a condition, but maybe isn't an end state of what we should be seeking. So we're really happy to have you here. And per your note, just as the disclaimer, since you did thank me in the acknowledgments, I will take that and let everyone know that I will still be an objective commentator on your book tonight. But thank you for the acknowledgement. Appreciate it. And we'll go ahead and start our conversation for this evening. And as uh, people who are regular habitees of book talks for the doorstep know, Tatiana always has a well marked up copy, or in this case, perhaps a marked up PDF of the book. And to throw it out to her to start our conversation for this evening.
Thank you so much again, Ollie, for joining us. We're so excited to have you. And yes, I love paper books. I love the tactile feel of them. Today, I only have this to show our audience. America's Great Power Opportunity, Revitalizing U.S. Foreign Policy to Meet the Challenges of Strategic Competition. And I have to tell everyone that it won't be available here in the U.S. until July. So this is, we feel very lucky to have you because this is even before you start kind of your grand tour, you are coming to us first. So thank you for coming to us before the book is even here in the U.S. I cannot wait. I did get an advance copy, so I do feel also lucky on that front. But when I get my copy, I will be sure to mark it up. Yes, in lieu of that, though, I do have many notes because what one thing your book is prescient. It is exactly the question that we need to be asking on May 17th, 2022. What is the role of the United States? And two points that I think you make very well in the book, and they're kind of part of your solutions in the afterword and in the final chapter. But the two things that are my takeaways that I'd like you to kind of maybe start with, and then we'll go into the specific country and, to your point, the geographic and the transnational issues that we need to be looking at. But the overarching theme, I think, number one, is that we as a country need to be more active and not defensive, right? So we need more offense, less defense. And right now I feel we're in a very defensive mode. But I think that you have great recommendations that I'm going to leave to you to share to our audience. Audience, I want to remind you to please put your questions in the chat. We'll be reading them in the second half. And the second thing that I found is hope. Which I think we also need a good dose of because I've been actually helping students this semester look for nuclear bunkers around New York City. So I'm very glad that there's a very strong sense of optimism, not Pollyanna, but based in realism, based in there are things that we can do. And so I'd like to start off with those two things as an overarching theme before we move into specific examples. And again, thank you and welcome again.
Well, Tatiana, thank you so much. Nick, thank you so much. I only wish we were having this conversation in person, but hopefully, knock on wood, hopefully, circumstances will permit us to have this next conversation in person. But thank you so much. And the acknowledgments in the book, I felt it was very, very important to acknowledge the role that the Carnegie Council has played. When I think back to the Carnegie Council study groups in which I've had the pleasure of participating. When I think about the conversations we've had on the Doorstep podcast, they played a very important role. When I think back, actually, even just a few years when the book first began taking shape, a lot of the conversations that the three of us had, a lot of the study groups you convened, they played a very important role early on when I was first, before even actually putting pen to paper, even just organizing some of my preliminary hypotheses about great power competition. So the Carnegie Council has played a really indispensable role in helping bring this forthcoming book to fruition. So I want to say thank you, and it's wonderful to be with you. So Tatiana, on those 2 points that you mentioned, you really have distilled the essence of the book, and I hope that other folks, as they're reading the book, whether it's a PDF or a hard copy, but I hope that they sort of come away with those 2 messages. So the first one about the imperative of a more proactive foreign policy and a less reactive foreign policy. I was initially thinking of including in the title somewhere great power competition, but then I said to myself, the book, yes, it does articulate a critique of great power competition as a blueprint for U.S. foreign policy, but I wanted to offer more than a critique, and I should say a little bit by way of just kind of the genesis of the book. So the genesis of the book originated as critique, and I think that both of you have a sense of some of my critiques of great power competition as a policy construct, and I do flesh those out at some length in the book. But when I was stress testing some of my initial hypotheses, some of my assumptions, one of the most common responses that I got, and rightfully so, one of the most common responses that I got from folks was, okay, I disagree with some of your critiques. Maybe you've sold me somewhat on some of your critiques of great power competition, but if not great power competition as the orienting construct for U.S. foreign policy, then what? And it was that then what question that came up again and again and again, and rightly so, because I think that the more strenuously or the more vigorously you critique a prevailing policy construct, the more it behooves you to articulate an alternative, or just to be honest and say, all I can offer you is a critique. I don't actually have an alternative to offer. And so I wanted to spend some time thinking about that question, sort of, if not, then what? And that's really what the last chapter of the book tries to do. And as I was looking at the first iteration of the text and thinking, what would be a title that really captures both the critique, but also sort of a more hopeful posture, I said, why not just substitute competition, or why not just substitute opportunity for competition? And well, what is the opportunity that I describe, or that I mention in the title? The opportunity, and I also argue in the book, really the imperative for U.S. foreign policy is, can the United States articulate an affirmative vision of its place in the world? Can it articulate an affirmative vision of global order that is not tethered to what China does, that is not tethered to what Russia does? Now, I immediately hasten to note, since, as you've seen, a big part of the book is about how the United States should appraise the competitive challenge from China, how it should appraise the competitive challenge from Russia. So in saying that the opportunity to formulate a foreign policy that isn't tethered to or predicated upon China and Russia's decisions is in no way to be sanguine about the competitive challenges that those countries pose. It's in no way to say certainly that we should ignore China and Russia. We can't. And obviously I'm sure we'll be talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine in our conversation. But the point is, a reactive foreign policy says that the United States, absent external nation state competitors, may not be able to articulate its place in the world, may not be able to orient itself. And what I try to articulate in the book is that by focusing principally on what the United States can control, so the United States cannot unilaterally control what China does. It cannot unilaterally control what Russia does. The United States does, however, have full control over 2 phenomena. Phenomenon number 1, the decisions it makes, and phenomenon number 2, the decision it elects not to make. And so what I try to argue in the book is that by focusing more on those 2 phenomena, by focusing more on what the United States can control, and in particular, I focus on this panoply of competitive advantages that the United States possesses, I think in many cases, unique competitive advantages. By focusing more on harnessing those unique competitive advantages anew, repurposing them for a more complex, messier geopolitics, and making renewal sort of the bedrock of U.S. foreign policy, I think the more we focus on renewal, managing a resurgent China, managing an irredentist Russia, of course, but centering our foreign policy on renewal, the more we make renewal the center of U.S. foreign policy, I think the less susceptible U.S. foreign policy will be to distraction, the less susceptible U.S. foreign policy will be to various machinations or provocations by China and Russia. So on your first point that you brought up, it's really designing a foreign policy that is focused more on what the United States affirmatively endorses rather than what it reactively opposes. And that really brings me to and on your second point about hope. And I appreciate your mentioning that it's not a Pollyannish hope. It's a quiet hope, and one of the kind of the tone I hope that readers will take away is I'm trying to articulate the case for a quietly confident U.S. foreign policy. So I think in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, one could argue, I think rightly so, that the United States perhaps veered too far in the direction of complacency. And understandably, the United States was exhausted after nearly half a century of a systemic, world-spanning, multi-dimensional competition with the Soviet Union. And the dissolution of the Soviet Union, by default, made the United States the world's preeminent power. And there was a real sense that U.S. preeminence had won the day, that the values underpinning that preeminence had won the day, and that the United States, its values, the values it promulgated, the system that it underpinned, would essentially inexorably go from strength to strength. So I think that there's an argument to be made that perhaps in the immediate sort of heady days of the post-Cold War, that the United States veered too far in the direction of complacency, underestimated the extent to which China and Russia might one day be able and willing to contest its national interests. But there's always a risk when pendula swing. There's always a risk of overcorrection. And if complacency is one peril, then I think consternation is an opposite peril. But it also is a peril. We don't want to underestimate China and Russia. We don't want to aggrandize them. And so what I try to argue in the book, and the bulk of the book is looking at the respective competitive challenges posed by China and Russia. And I make the argument that they are enduring competitors. I think that they're multidimensional competitors. And I don't think that either of them, despite their myriad vulnerabilities at home, their myriad vulnerabilities abroad, it doesn't seem, based on where we are today on May 17th, 2022, that either China or Russia is poised for a dramatic sort of Soviet-style disintegration. So we can't be complacent. And China and Russia are obviously today far more able, far more willing to contest U.S. influence than they were 30 years ago. So that's the argument for saying we shouldn't be complacent. But I also try to make the argument that China and Russia, despite being formidable, multidimensional competitors that are likely to endure, and so therefore the imperative becomes cohabitation, I don't think that they are overwhelming challengers. And as we can talk about later, China and Russia, they face very significant challenges at home, very significant challenges abroad. I think that China and Russia are also Russia far more blunderingly than China, but China and Russia in different ways, I think, are undercutting their diplomatic stature, and I think that they are mobilizing a lot of external opposition. And so at the same time that we don't want to succumb to complacency, we don't want to succumb to consternation, I would much rather face America's strategic challenges than those confronting China and Russia. So again, it's a case for quiet confidence. There's a lot of work that the United States has to do. America's competitive advantages will not just renew themselves. There's no law that says America's competitive advantages will automatically renew themselves. There's a lot of work that has to be done abroad and at home. But I think that, again, if we focus on renewal, if we place the respective competitive challenges from China and Russia in what I would argue is their proper perspective, then I think that there is a case for a quiet hope and quiet confidence.
I love talking competitive advantage because it's looking at America, China, Russia, the rest of the world, the globe as a business, right? It's a business case. We're writing in the Harvard Business Review here, and but it's a way to speak that I think we need to engage business leaders, right? We're not just here talking to policymakers today and the general public. We are trying to engage everyone, right? So our initiative is U.S. global engagement, but part of global engagement is engaging all the constituents that are interested in foreign policy here in the U.S. And so, as a management consultant graduate, I love the talk of competitive advantage, comparative advantage, and in a way that helps to counteract this fears, right? So you mentioned in various places in the book, studies from Pew that identify China, as a threat, by the population. The latest one I saw was that 9 out of 10 Americans are very concerned by the combination of Russia and China, and everything is this, again, this pendulum to scary, right? Be very afraid. versus thinking to some of your points of advantages. So I want to highlight a few because, I love talking about Gen Z. So I love talking about the population, and you very clearly identified Russia and China both have a population problem, right? It's an aging population, and that is going to be an extreme disadvantage, right? And the US does not have that problem. There's also the immigration problem. Nobody's immigrating to Russia right now.
Voluntarily, at
right.
least.
Right. So, and that is a strength of the United States. And these two underlying strengths underlie innovation, which is a comparative advantage that both China. So these things, the youth factor and the innovation factor, I think, cannot be underestimated and are not spoken about enough, I don't think. And so I wonder if you can talk to those 2 points when looking at this idea of the U.S. competitive advantage and how we can be more proactive with those two areas.
Absolutely. And I think, and again, I do want to stress that I don't want to come across as being overly sanguine. So certainly, the geopolitical environment confronting the United States today is far less auspicious than the geopolitical environment confronting the United States confronted in 1991. And so I don't want to be overly sanguine. And again, China and Russia are certainly far more able, far more willing to contest U.S. influence today than they were 30 years ago. But I think, as you mentioned, so looking at just kind of the panoply of American competitive advantages, America's demographic outlook. I think if you speak with most demographers, they would say that of the major powers or of the great powers, the United States arguably has the most favorable demographic outlook. It's not a demographic outlook that's without its challenges. If you look at the rapid societal aging, other stresses on the American sort of body politic. Again, don't want to be overly sanguine, but again, among major powers, among great powers, I think most demographers would say that America probably has the most favorable demographic outlook, and certainly vis-a-vis China and Russia, its demographic outlook is vastly more favorable. Immigration. I'm a child of immigrants, and so for me, immigration is not just an abstract competitive advantage; it is very much an advantage that I've experienced, personally. My parents, they left Pakistan when they were very young, and there was a lot of uncertainty when you leave behind family, friends, all that and you come, you move thousands of miles, across oceans to settle in a new country. There's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of anxiety, but when they decided that they wanted to have children, they said, America is a place where whatever happens, we feel that our children are going to have opportunities that we didn't have. And again, and you hear the story again and again, young immigrants from around the world taking that risk, leaving everything behind and settling here, and and having setting up businesses, their children have opportunities that their parents didn't have. So immigration is a tremendous advantage. So the late Lee Kuan Yew was a leader of Singapore. He was often asked, because he was someone who and he was one of the rare figures when he was alive who was, I think, equally trusted by American officials and Chinese officials, and kind of served as an interlocutor between them. And he was often asked, do you think that China will overtake the United States as the world's preeminent power? And he was often asked, kind of do this net assessment. What are America's principal competitive advantages? What are China's? And one of the advantages for the United States that he always cited was its ability to attract talent from around the world. And so he said China has an extraordinary talent base, roughly 1.3 at the time when he was speaking, 1.3 billion people, now about 1.4 billion people. So China has an extraordinarily large talent base, 1.4 billion people. But he said that the United States has a much larger talent base. It not only has sort of its domestic population, but it can draw on talent from around the world. And so you have immigrants from around the world who come to the United States, and they become part of the American story. They're setting up businesses. They're coming up with innovations. They are becoming public servants, and they really are contributing to the American story. And they contribute not only demographically, economically, technologically, but I think they contribute in a really powerful ideational way. And when you think about what makes the United States the world's preeminent power, it's not just its military prowess, its economic size, its technological advantage. I think thinking about America as an idea, the ability of the United States to attract individuals from around the world, and they come to the United States and make common cause, and they work alongside one another the ability of the United States via immigration to refresh itself, to renew itself, to adapt itself to various societal challenges that present themselves to each generation, I think is a tremendous ideational advantage. Innovation we talked about, and of course, its system of higher education, which remains unrivaled. Now, again, none of those advantages are American birthrights. It takes hard work, and it will continue to take hard work to renew those advantages, but they are formidable. And then if you look at the external side of the ledger, again, very compelling advantages. Look at America's diplomatic network. Now, again, America's diplomatic network, it's under stress. It's under stress from within, it's under stress from without, but it remains a formidable advantage. And one of the observations, I don't know if I mentioned it in the book, I think I did, but if I didn't mention it in the book, I'll just mention it here. One of the op-eds I often sort of revisit when I think about this kind of competitive advantages in doing this comparative net assessment, Yan Shuitong. So Yan Shuitong, he's one of China's most distinguished scholars of international relations, and he wrote an op-ed in 2011. I think it was November 20th, 2011, if I'm not mistaken. And it was in the New York Times entitled, How China Can Defeat America. And in this op-ed, he's enumerating what he believes are China's competitive advantages, and he's highlighting America's political polarization, its political dysfunction, and he's doing this net assessment. But he says, and I'm roughly paraphrasing him, he says the core of competition between the United States and China, at least externally, on the world stage, is going to come down to who has more what he calls high-quality friends, essentially allies and partners. And the United States, despite the reality that its diplomatic network is under strain, it still has a vast network of alliances and partnerships in Europe, in Asia, and we've seen in responding, just as an example, in responding to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've seen America's ability to mobilize its allies and partners in Europe. In responding to an increasingly assertive China, we've seen the United States' ability to mobilize allies and partners in Asia. China doesn't have that. China doesn't have anything comparable to that sort of diplomatic network. Now, by virtue of just its sheer economic size, by virtue of its innovative capacity, and importantly, by virtue of the narrative momentum generated by that economic heft and technological capacity, China can make a lot of inroads, but on a largely transactional basis. China doesn't have a comparable diplomatic network, and scholars such as Professor Yan have argued that until and unless China is able to achieve a diplomatic network of comparable scale and of comparable depth to the one that the United States possesses, that it's going to be hamstrung in competition. So again, you look internally, you look externally, the United States has a lot of, I think, really unique, competitive advantages. The challenge will be sort of a challenge, but I think also an opportunity. It is, I know it's somewhat cliche to say, we are sort of at an inflection point for U.S. policy, or the international system is we're sort of at another sort of present at the creation moment. It's cliche to make that statement, but I do think that in this case, that cliche, it really is borne out. And I think that one of the challenges for the United States, in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in light of a coronavirus pandemic that continues to wreak havoc on the global economy, that continues to wreak havoc on geopolitics, the United States does need to think about its own role in the world, perhaps some of the limits to its influence, but also how can it basically repurpose its competitive advantages? How can it harness its diplomatic network anew, not only to focus on contesting China and Russia, although I think that contestation is certainly an important part and will remain an integral part of U.S. foreign policy, but also how do we reconcile the imperatives of great power competition and the imperatives of managing transnational challenges? There's a lot of talk, and I'll make this one last point, and then I'll stop. There's a lot of talk about sort of the emergence of ideological blocks, or sort of stronger, or more clearly delineated demarcations, perhaps between the United States and its allies and partners on the one hand, and sort of China and Russia and a Sino-Russian entente, on the other hand. There's a lot of talk about sort of economic disentanglement, perhaps even some measure of geopolitical disentanglement, and yet I think one could make the argument that as transnational challenges grow in number and severity, they actually are going to make the world even more interdependent. And so I think that one of the challenges, but also the opportunities for the United States, is what does a U.S. foreign policy look like that manages competitive frictions with China and Russia, but also recognizes that inescapable interdependence? I wish I wish that I could imagine a plausible scenario or convince myself that there exists a plausible scenario in which the United States can advance its vital national interests solely in conjunction with its allies and partners. And I think if that scenario were to exist, I think that it would make U.S. foreign policy, it would spare U.S. foreign policy for a lot of headaches. I think it would make America's life a lot easier. But when you look at China and Russia's proportions, you look at their aggregated military assets, their aggregated economic heft. China and Russia, I think individually and collectively, they're simply too large to be locked away in some geopolitical closet and have us take away the key. And the United States, as unpalatable, and it especially in light of Russia's barbarism in Ukraine, it's painful to make this kind of statement. The United States retains a range of interdependencies with Russia and with China, and I at least cannot articulate or conceptualize a scenario in which the United States can deal with the next pandemic, because there will be another pandemic after COVID-19, in which the United States can bend the arc of climate change, in which the United States can manage arms control or engage in arms control, in which the United States can deal with the panoply of frontier technologies that are gaining momentum. I don't see a scenario in which the United States can manage that inventory of transnational challenges without engaging China and Russia in some way. And when we use the word engagement, engagement is not a starry-eyed term. Engagement is not an idealistic term. Engagement, to my mind, simply denotes interaction with others. So you engage with your allies, you engage with your partners, you engage with competitors, you engage with adversaries, and you engage with competitors and adversaries not because you want to, but because the dictates of geopolitics require that interaction. And so I think that it's going to be a tremendously challenging period for U.S. foreign policy. But when there's great challenges, there's also, I think it's a very fertile moment analytically and prescriptively to think about what would a new U.S. foreign policy look like to deal with that very, very difficult set of challenges.
As you've been laying all of this out, one of the things that is coming to mind as I'm hearing your comments is, well, first of all, the opportunity question linked to competition, which is, as we've seen over the last year, and particularly over the last several months, both on Russian and on Chinese social media, once again, the attractiveness of, is it time to leave? Should we emigrate to the United States? And we don't see a reciprocal. You don't see on American social media people saying, should we really be thinking about relocating to China or to Russia? And again, that ability to attract people to the United States is an immense source of strength in the international system. And then as you were laying out all of this, it really, I started hearing echoes of when we've had a guest like Nahal Tusion from Politico talking really that this isn't easily subdivided into foreign policy and domestic policy. This is really, as she puts it, and using the term in the Biden administration, it's omni policy, that America's ability to lead in the world is going to depend on our ability to be able to receive and integrate immigrants. It's going to depend on an education system that educates people. It's going to depend on a business climate that encourages innovation. And that at the same time, and I really liked your point about renewal, because I think that this is something that changes the focus, is that right now the focus, in my own opinion, is negative. It is the United States is being left behind, certainly by China. Up to February, we had worries about Russia, but it was framed in a negative sense. And yet, what you're laying out here is that an America that has gone through renewal will have a certain degree of confidence, not, as you put it, not arrogance or complacency, but it will be confident to engage. It will be confident to reach out because it has, uh, renewed itself, renewed its economy, renewed its social fabric, and it can offer. In essence, it's a version of the dirty and clean glass test, which is a United States which has the ability to say we've gone to the next stage of green energy development. We've gone to the next stage in terms of pharmaceutical development, and we can say partnering with us or reaching out and engaging with us gives you these options, and if your country chooses not to, then it is we can offer we don't have to force the glass on anyone, but in essence, it seems that what you're saying is we'll be able to offer that clean glass of water to countries rather than to say, well, the other glasses on the bar perhaps are not as clean or is not as attractive. Without us having to impose anything or force anything, it'll be essentially restoring that attractive nature. Is that perhaps where you're seeing when you talk about this not as great power competition, but great power opportunity, not
Oh,
only for the
absolutely.
U.S. but for others? So sorry.
No, I mean, absolute. Sorry to to cut you off, but it was just to sort of convey to sort of the the vigorousness of my agreement with what you just said. And I would make 2 points, Nick, in response to what you just said. One is, and I try to make this point in the book, domestic renewal, and I think, and I like this notion of sort of that Nahal Tusi brought up of sort of omni policy. I think that there is a tendency, we think about sort of foreign policy, we silo foreign policy and domestic policy. We silo sort of, the renewal of America's external competitive advantages and the renewal of America's internal competitive advantages. And yet, one of the arguments I try to set forth in the book is that domestic renewal is not simply something that the United States, can, should, and must do in parallel with external renewal. I would argue that domestic renewal is a precondition for America's ability to re-engage proactively and confidently on the global stage. And so I give this kind of stylized example in the book to make this point. So imagine you are a physical trainer and a new client comes into your office and says, "I'd like to run a marathon," and we haven't met before. And I would say, "Okay, well, great. I'm glad to hear that you want to run a marathon, but let me sort of first get a sense of sort of your vitals, your health, and let me see you run a mile." Now, if this new client, if this individual collapses while running a mile, it would be irresponsible of you to say, "Well, go ahead and run a marathon tomorrow." You want to first make sure that you can sort of, do a mile first, then maybe do a 5K, and then think about a marathon. Similarly, when the United States says we want to mobilize coalitions abroad to manage transnational challenges or to respond to Russian aggression, I do think that an important precondition of America's ability to mobilize those coalitions, to offer global leadership, is to demonstrate a renewed ability to manage its internal challenges. And I think one of the reasons why America's experience with the coronavirus pandemic has been so damaging reputationally, we just crossed, whether you look at you look at Johns Hopkins monitor, you look at the CDC monitor, the United States has crossed over 1 million deaths. Accounts for roughly 4% of the world's population, but far and away has the largest number of deaths from COVID-19, well over 80 million COVID-19 infections. And so I think that and it's not just competitors. I think that even, and perhaps especially, many of America's greatest well-wishers abroad, they look at America's management of COVID-19. They look at rising income and wealth inequality. They look at the vagaries of America's domestic politics and really the viciousness of political polarization or tribalization. They look at this panoply of transnational challenges and they say, can the United States, now the United States has been through, and many of the historians with whom I spoke when writing the book, many historians, they said, look, the United States has been through many periods of internal upheaval, which undoubtedly has. Look at the 1960s and 1970s. We fought an actual civil war in the middle of the 19th century, and obviously the founding years of the Republic were very, very tumultuous. So again, the United States has been through many periods of internal upheaval. It has renewed itself. And so we shouldn't be fatalistic. And I think that there is sometimes, every generation says, never before has the United States faced internal challenges greater in number, greater in severity, greater in complexity. And perhaps there's a little bit of hyperbole in that proposition, but I think that there's always, I think, a kernel of truth in that proposition. And I do think in one of the books that I came across by Suzanne Mettler and Robert Lieberman, they wrote a book recently in which they identify four forces that have historically tested the United States, have challenged its democracy, have challenged its ability to engage in democratic renewal. And the argument that they make, and I think quite convincingly, is that at various periods of domestic upheaval, trial, and tribulation, various permutations or various sets of those four threats presented themselves and challenged American democracy and the prospects for American democratic renewal. They make the argument now that all four of those are in full force. And so I think that, again, a lot of Americans, whether you're a competitor, whether you're a well-wisher, you say, America, we want to see you better able to deal with pandemic disease. We want to see you better able to rein in income and wealth inequality. We want to see you better able to deal with this panoply of internal challenges. And then, if and as you do so, then let's talk about sort of more grandiose sort of ambitions for the world. So the first point is this really inextricable interdependence, this inextricable linkage between domestic renewal and external leadership. So that's point number one. Point number two is, and this also sort of goes to what I discuss as being the opportunity in the title of the book, and how we can formulate a foreign policy that isn't tethered as tightly to what China does, isn't tethered as tightly to what Russia does. And here's one instance in which I think that the Cold War is very, very instructive. I think there are lessons that we shouldn't learn from the Cold War, but here's, I think, one lesson we should learn from the Cold War. So Melvin Leffler, a professor at the University of Virginia, he makes a very convincing argument that some of the steps that the United States took in competing with the Soviet Union, they helped enhance Washington's strategic competitiveness vis-a-vis Moscow, but they didn't require Moscow to be invoked in order to be justified. So he gives the example of the Marshall Plan. He gives the example of the establishment of some of the Bretton Woods institutions that formed the building blocks of what came to be known as the post-war order. And Professor Leffler, I think, very persuasively argues that it is true that the Marshall Plan, by helping to resuscitate Europe, it's true that a healthier, more robust Europe partnered with the United States or allied with the United States certainly conferred a competitive advantage in dealing with the Soviet Union, but the United States didn't have to invoke the Soviet Union to justify the Marshall Plan. And similarly, in setting up and leading the establishment of various Bretton Woods institutions, again, those institutions did help the United States to compete with the Soviet Union, but the United States didn't have to invoke the Soviet Union. Washington could simply say, look, we've experienced now the scourge of two world wars. We've experienced the scourge of World War I. We've experienced the scourge of World War II. We need to establish a post-war order that can avert the scourge of another world war, that can avert another Great Depression. And I think that the lesson for today is that there are many steps that the United States can and should take, whether at home, whether abroad, that would repurpose and renew those competitive advantages, but without invoking China or Russia. And I think that the more, and I'll just make one last point, I often will sort of pose to friends and colleagues kind of a fill in the blank exercise, and I think it's very useful for our conversation. The more that we can, if you were to say America's role in the world should be fill in the blank, U.S. foreign policy should strive to achieve fill in the blank. The more that you can fill in those blanks without having to invoke the names of your competitors, I think the more confidence you project. And I think that in speaking with our allies and partners, of course, and I don't want to be sanguine, of course we have to talk about China. Of course we have to talk about Russia. They are two major players in the international system. Russia is wreaking havoc on Europe's order and by extension global order with its invasion of Ukraine. China is obviously becoming more assertive. It has a very powerful economy. So the point is not to put the blinders on and to ignore China and Russia. But the point is that when we engage with our allies and partners, we shouldn't allow China and Russia to dictate the substance of those conversations. China and Russia's behavior and attitudes should inform those conversations, should perhaps shape those conversations, but shouldn't dictate those. And I think that the more that the United States, and I'll stop here, the more that the United States can articulate affirmatively what it is that it seeks to accomplish in the world, what it is that it seeks to do at home, without having to invoke its competitors, I think that the more we project confidence, the more we project also a sense that, hey, we can renew ourselves. We've been able to renew ourselves before. We can renew ourselves again. And I think that that's a message that I think would gain much more traction with allies and partners than one that is overly China and Russia centric.
You've got me thinking, though, but isn't the war in Russia or Russia against Ukraine creating an opportunity to respond to a certain situation, right? And renew the image of the United States in the world. So I'm wondering if it's actually some sort of symbiotic thing that can happen and not this binary. And only because I saw today, a headline from the New York Times, McConnell takes on isolationist wing of GOP and the fight for Ukraine aid. And his quote, "It's important for the United States to help. It's important for to help the free world." And it was this kind of grandiose talk. And I'm wondering, what you think about this hypothesis that in fact, maybe we shouldn't be reactive and responding, but that it's created an opportunity for the United States to rethink its position. And I'm wondering, since you wrote, the book, and I know you have many updates in the afterword, but maybe, after you wrote the afterword, it's been a couple months, have you thought more about this idea that now in particular, because of what's happening, not only in what Russia's doing in Ukraine, but also the relationship between China supporting Russia, not supporting Russia, is enabling the United States to find its roots again a little bit?
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, and one of the points that I make in the afterword, and I think it's become more pronounced in the interval since I submitted the afterword in the final version of the afterword in March, and here we are now in May. One of the reasons I think that the United States does have a strategic opportunity is in light of Russia's blundering. And again, China hasn't been as blundering as Russia, but I'll talk about China in a little bit. I mean, remember that, if you think about, and we often, in the context of the Carnegie Council, we often talk about narratives, whether domestic policy narratives, foreign policy narratives. And one of the narratives that had been prevalent, I certainly encountered a lot when I was interviewing folks for the book, when I was doing research. One of the narratives that I encountered again and again and again in conversations, in research, in reading, it was a narrative of this hapless United States, facing off again. Russia is engaged in 3D chess. It is stealthily ubiquitous. It is under behind every frayed U.S. relationship, Russia. Behind every unfair or seemingly unfair election, Russia. I mean, you got this sense of sort of Russia as being sort of stealthily, ubiquitous, outwitting this hapless United States. Similarly, China, there's a sense that America, it thinks in very, very short time increments. China thinks in much more expansive time increments. It's much more diplomatically savvy. It's cultivating its relationships in a much more strategic way. And I think the developments of the past few months have really dented those narratives, really challenged those narratives. So, I'll begin with Russia and then talk about, China. Russia, it is difficult to think. It's difficult to think of many, at least in recent memory, it's difficult to think of many other single actions by major powers or great powers that have constituted such extraordinary acts of strategic self-sabotage. Think about what Russia has done with its invasion of Ukraine and now doubling down on its barbarism in Ukraine. Russia has given the Transatlantic Alliance a new lease on life. And think about several months ago, the Transatlantic Alliance, remember the conversation after the signing of AUKUS, and remember sort of the strains that AUKUS introduced into the Transatlantic Alliance. Russia's invasion has given the Transatlantic Alliance a new lease on life. It has reinvigorated the notion of the West, a West that can act cohesively. Russia has given NATO a new lease on life, and it's now very likely we'll see when Secretary of State Tony Blinken talks with his counterpart from Turkey, we'll see if Turkey's objections to Finnish and Swedish membership in NATO, if those objections are able to be overcome. But it seems very likely that NATO will now incorporate Sweden and Finland. So Russia has given the Transatlantic Alliance a new lease on life. It has given the West new meaning. It's given the NATO alliance a new lease on life. What else has happened? Russia is yet further beholden to China than it was prior to the invasion. Russia has cut itself off substantially from global finance. It has cut itself off substantially from inputs that are critical for technological innovation, all in one fell swoop. And Russia is doubling down. Now, if you are, and we were talking earlier about business, many multinational corporations now are exiting or significantly paring down their operations because of just the reputational damage of doing business in Russia. And so in terms of just sort of the gap between where Russia is and where it once thought that it might be, I was just rereading a speech, or I think it was an article, not a speech. It was an article that President Putin wrote also in 2011, in which he was articulating this was a much more auspicious time for Russian foreign policy and for Russia's place in the world. And President Putin in this article was trying to lay out where he wanted Russia to be. And I'm roughly paraphrasing him. But in this 2011 article, he said, I, meaning President Putin, I imagine Russia as being this thriving economic intermediary between the West and the Asia Pacific. Now Russia is going to be, is going to be struggling to claw itself out of an economic hole, a diplomatic hole, a reputational hole. Again, it's made itself further beholden to China. So Russia, by virtue of its blundering, I think has certainly created opportunities for the United States. And China, it's in terms of the timing, February 4th, 2022, China and Russia declare that they have a friendship with no limits. I think that China now is increasingly appreciating that the friendship not only does have limits, but that friendship is becoming this growing reputational albatross around its neck. And China has this very, very complicated balance to strike. On the one hand, it doesn't want to disavow Russia, and it's certainly not going to disavow Russia publicly. It wants to maintain that partnership. It shares many of Russia's grievances against U.S. foreign policy. But Russia, reputationally, again, it's becoming more and more of a burden. And I think that the fact that Russia hasn't more publicly denounced Russia's aggression in Ukraine is really incurring tremendous reputational costs for China. And so a lot of the estrangement between China and advanced industrial democracies that we saw during the course of the pandemic, the first 2 years of the pandemic, has only grown as a result of China's failure to condemn Russian aggression. So I think Russia's barbarism, the reputational effect of the reputational impact by sort of virtue of association means that this narrative that I think was kind of more prevalent at the beginning of 22 or the beginning of 2021, that the United States was down and out, the West was down and out, and that China and Russia are going from strength to strength and are strategically and cleverly outwitting this hapless United States. I think that narrative, I think, is substantially dented. But there's an important caveat to register. And the caveat that I want to register is that shock-induced unity, and I think that what we're seeing right now between the United States and the European Union, it's a unity born of shock. I think that there were many U.S. observers and many European observers who didn't think that Russia would actually invade Ukraine.
Yeah.
Unity that is born of shock doesn't necessarily endure in perpetuity. And we already are starting to see, it's true, Russia is certainly, I mean, there's right now basically, I would say maybe not a permanent rupture between Russia and the West, but certainly as long as President Putin is at the helm of Russia, it's difficult to see what a path sort of for rapprochement between Russia and the West would look like. So Russia is certainly substantially now cut off from the West. It's more beholden to China, but Russia isn't necessarily a global pariah. So again, it still has its relationship with China. It still has a relationship with India. It still has a relationship with many countries in the developing world that are wary of a new Cold War. And also, as the externalities from Russia's invasion of Ukraine grow more pronounced, I think that there is going to be potentially more fraying of this unity that we're seeing now, more of a push for a negotiated settlement, more of a push for de-escalation. Look at not only disruptions to energy markets, look at disruptions to food markets, and look at the potential. Lawrence Friedman just had an article on his Substack in which he said, look at Russia's blockade of Ukrainian ports in the Black Sea. That blockade is wreaking havoc on the global economy. It's wreaking havoc on food markets, energy markets. And so I think that the longer this war drags on, the more that those externalities become more pronounced, and the more of a risk there is that this bubbling proxy war could potentially escalate into a direct armed confrontation. I think the less likely it is you're going to see that transatlantic unity endure in perpetuity. So what does that mean? What that means is, while you have this extraordinary transatlantic coalescence, we should be thinking about in the United States and the European Union, we should be thinking 3 months ahead, 6 months ahead, 12 months ahead. We should be thinking about recognizing that this transatlantic coalescence is likely going to diminish in intensity as time passes. What can we do in this window of opportunity while we are substantially congealed? As the shock of Russia's invasion recedes, as we settle into this protracted, indefinitely long war of attrition, what should we do with this present transatlantic coalescence to get us over that hump, so that as the shock from the war recedes, we still can pursue an affirmative agenda? So I think that Russia's invasion has definitely created a significant opportunity for the United States, and particularly its European allies and partners, but it's not an opportunity that will last permanently. So we need to be thinking about what to do with it. And then similarly, I think in thinking about, China, I think, and here's an important distinction, the coalescence that we're seeing between the United States and its allies and partners in response to Russia, it's much more immediate, it's much more sweeping because it's born of shock. I think that Europe, for many European countries, the idea in the 21st century of witnessing another interstate war was inconceivable. So right now we're seeing a unity born of shock. China's resurgence, to the extent that it's prompting coalescence, it's more gradual. I think it's more gradual. It's also more complicated, just because China economically is so much more substantially integrated into the global economy. It's so much more important to global supply chains. So it's when you're dealing with a country such as Russia, now Russia it's not a bit-sized economy, but certainly it's economically nowhere near the proportions of China, relatively. And again, I want to emphasize relative because Russia it still commands a major economy. It is relatively easier to impose the kind of sanctions that advanced industrial democracies have imposed on Russia. With China, it becomes harder, and I think that also there's going to be more reluctance in Europe, I think, to think about substantially more decoupling. So as we think about contesting Russia, contesting China, again, contestation of China and Russia, it's going to be a significant part of the conversations that the United States has with its allies and partners, and certainly Russia's blundering, its aggression, its barbarism, has created a tremendous opportunity for the United States to find common cause, particularly with its European allies and partners. But we need to be thinking beyond the crisis of the day, beyond the provocation, of the day, and thinking about absent or in addition to those crises and those provocations as stimulants for greater coalescence. What are some more affirmative purposes that can sustain us even in the absence of those crises and provocations?
Yeah, I think that raises and I think what a service that your book is doing to this conversation is precisely this point about a unity born of shock, and you only have a window to convert that into something longer lasting. So we've seen that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for instance, has led to rare instances of bipartisanship in Washington, that for the most part, with some exceptions, you have a bipartisan consensus. You've seen a consensus among European, Asian allies with the United States to do certain things, but you have to convert that over time into something that is longer lasting. And when you were saying that, I was thinking about, we had all of this talk, and you were part of these conversations with us at Carnegie on this at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Was this the shock to get businesses and countries to de-link supply chains and relink? And we saw movement, and then we kind of snapped back into, well, it's expensive, and let's just go back to the good old days, as it were. And I think it's a similar issue that you could see with Russia and at least some European economies that would say, well, it's expensive to diversify and to decouple. And as you point out there has to be this affirmative narrative that really this can be a goad. And I think echoing Tatiana's question, right, that it's not that we planned for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it has created this moment. And then it's not just simply about responding to Russia, but using this to kind of push the democratic community of nations forward. And I think, again, the way that you frame this, so many of the current debates about great power competition are still set as almost in a negative sense, or in a losing sense vis-a-vis Russia or China. We could lose to Russia or China, and this is an affirmative vision that says, yes, we need to cope with Russia and China. We may need to work with them at some point in the future, but this is really about the positive relationships. But I just worry, and I'll throw this out to you. Do you think, and you said we may be at another present at the creation moment? We saw in, again, with some exceptions, very strong bipartisan moves between 1945 and 1950. There was a strong degree of bipartisanship at the beginning of the 1990s, which moved certain things forward. Do you think that we can recreate that sense of common purpose again, or do you think, or do we run the risk that as the Ukraine crisis invasion drops from the headlines and things get normalized, that normalized in the sense that we get used to all of these disruptive impacts, that then we don't move ahead with this more positive, great power opportunity agenda?
I mean, Nick, this is my biggest concern. And even though, you both have seen from the book that even though most of the text is about, I would say sort of the core part of the text is about China, Russia, the Sino-Russian Entente. The more conversations I had, the more research I did, and certainly the more pen I put to paper, the more I came away feeling relatively. And again, I want to emphasize I'm not Pollyannish, and I don't want to come across as overly sanguine. But as I sort of came closer and closer to the finish line of putting the manuscript to rest, I felt relatively better about America's capacity, if it thinks affirmatively, if it thinks of opportunities, if it if it finds sort of this intermediate disposition, this intermediate psychological disposition between complacency and consternation, I felt that, okay, and given America's panoply of, I think in many cases, unique competitive advantages, which we've discussed, I came away thinking, okay, a resurgent China and an irredentist Russia, they are formidable challengers. They are multifaceted challengers. They are likely to prove enduring challengers, but they are manageable challengers. They're not overwhelming challengers. I came away more pessimistic, though, on America's internal landscape, on America's internal politics. And a lot of the questions about, I made this point earlier, and we've been talking, that America's ability to compete externally, in large part, is predicated on some sense of national cohesion, some sense of shared purpose. And if America is increasingly tearing itself apart, if Americans of different ideological persuasions increasingly come to regard one another not as fellow travelers, but as moral adversaries, a lot of the questions about external competition become moot. Now, it's because of that. It's because America's domestic politics are becoming so much more polarized, so much more tribalized, and so much more, I think, vicious in many cases. It's for that reason that there are many observers who hope, and I certainly share that hope, who hope that perhaps external competition can help the United States perhaps to not to eliminate that partisan rancor, but perhaps to suppress it. And there's this thought that in decades past, the United States, despite its internal squabbles, when faced with an overarching challenger, in the service of dealing with external competition, so whether it was dealing with Japan, Germany, the Soviet Union, that let's use external competition as a vehicle for internal cohesion. The United States does have a track record of making that linkage work. It's not clear to me, though, that we can make that linkage work again today. I hope we can. I certainly hope we can. And this is, it's a point that many observers, have made, that the United States has used in the past external anxiety about external competitors in the service of internal renewal. But there are questions about whether it can do so again. And I would point everyone who's listening to work by Rachel Myrick of Duke University, and she's done very, very convincing research. And she renders a cautious, I think, kind of a sobering warning to all of us. She does very, very careful research, and she casts doubt on this proposition that external competition today will be able to facilitate internal cohesion. I hope that it can, but I would commend her research, to all of you who are listening. I really think so. I would make one point. One, as Rachel Myrick has, I think, very persuasively argued, it's not clear that external competition today will necessarily facilitate internal renewal. And you look at some of the trend lines, number one. And number two, we shouldn't be using external competition as a crutch. And that's one of the points that I try to make in the book, is that even if, now, anxiety about external competitors, I think if it is one tool in a large toolkit, I think it's certainly welcome, but it should not be a crutch. In other words, when the United States is dealing with increasingly fractious internal politics, when it's confronting over 1 million deaths from COVID-19 and over 80 million infections, when it's confronting rising income and wealth inequality, in dealing with those challenges, the United States shouldn't say, we're dealing with these challenges because we want to be more competitive with China and Russia, even though certainly one of the benefits of dealing with our internal challenges more effectively will be to make us more competitive. It's one of the ancillary benefits. But competition with China and Russia shouldn't be the principal justification. The United States should be dealing with these internal challenges because it's our collective civic responsibility. It is our collective civic responsibility as citizens, as government officials. The principal remit, the principal charge of government officials is to look after the welfare of the citizens who have entrusted them with leadership. And so when we try to fix infrastructure, when we try to reduce income and wealth inequality, when we try to improve our healthcare system, we shouldn't have to invoke China or Russia or think about external competition. We should do so because it's the right it's the right step to do. It's the moral step to take, and it has that ancillary benefit. So again, I came away, worried more about America's internal challenges than about its external ones, and of course, the two are inextricably interlinked. And number two, anxiety about China, anxiety about Russia. If the United States can find a way to harness it constructively in the service of national renewal, great, but we shouldn't rely on it as a crutch. And I think that that's one of the points that I try to make in the book, is regarding competitive anxiety as one tool in a toolkit versus framing it as basically the kind of a cure-all, that basically absent external competition, we can't find our way. That shouldn't be the way that we go.
I think I could keep talking. We have reached time. So I want to remind our audience to send your questions to at Doorstep Podcast on Twitter, and we will answer them, and we'll get Ali to answer them. America's Great Power Opportunity, Revitalizing U.S. Foreign Policy to Meet the Challenges of Strategic Competition, July 2022, here stateside. It's already out in the UK. Jealous. Maybe I'll fly to London. Thank you so much for your time. And we do want to have you back, speaking of internals, because today happened to be primary day in a handful of states, which is definitely going to impact our internal competition conversations. So we will have you back to discuss what is up with that, probably after November. We'll see.
It will be a pleasure.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.